Hello, and welcome to another episode of Geopolitical Geeks and Random Thoughts. Joining me is my friend Aaron Workington. My name is Brian Lamb. Today we're talking about the what's going on in Iran currently, and also a little background information on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was signed in originally in 2015, and the aftermath, and also current events that have happened after the United States withdrew from it in 2018. Take it away.
Great. What we're going to do is just give a quick background related to Iran, and of course, one of its more controversial subjects that it's been developing nuclear technology. And part of that history is this is nothing new. This wasn't their interest in nuclear power and potentially nuclear weapons did not actually develop uh, just because the Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolution took place in 79. Actually, Iran's involvement in nuclear technology goes back to the 50s when the Eisenhower administration from the United States actually developed a program called Atoms for Peace, which was actually supplying friendly nations throughout the world with nuclear technology to develop peaceful forms of energy or peaceful forms of nuclear energy. Of course, the issue is in 79, after the Islamic Revolution, of course, foreign assistance and supplies were simply just cut off. And all of Western Europe and North America stopped interacting with Iran. Well, Russia or the Soviet Union at the time filled in that gap in providing them with that type of assistance. But it wasn't until the early 90s that Iran kind of came to the international or the UN, the international world, and they were willing to work with the international community because of sanctions on figuring out how they can continue to pursue nuclear technology and make it viable for their nation, yet still interact with Western democracies.
Yeah, and there is a rational basis for wanting to have nuclear power
Mhm.
because it is still one of the most efficient carbon free power sources that you can have anywhere. The waste components notwithstanding, of course, and that's why probably the U.S. was so gung ho about it back in the 50s and 60s, because the waste problem hadn't really been documented yet, or the ability to extract plutonium and uranium from it as well.
Right. And then when you look at the fact that even under the Shah, pre-Islamic Revolution, Iran was already becoming nervous about its oil supplies. So it was really interested in investing into types of energy like nuclear energy that could make it more self-sufficient and not be so reliant on oil, essentially
Right,
tapping its reserves. So,
right. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting that they actually ratified this non-proliferation treaty in 1970, like during when they were getting aid from the U.S.
yes, correct. So what took place is once again that was during the Shah, and the Shah, of course, was supported both politically and militarily from the West, and he was very reliant on Western, both sending young Iranians to Western universities and also receiving economic aid. So they that of course that's a whole another political issue about the Shah and how he interacted with his people and what was he really
Right,
expecting from the West when
right.
he, you know, interacted with them. So
Yeah, and so the fear of Iran becoming a nuclear power, based on, I would say, mostly intelligence from Israel. I wouldn't say that that was coming from the West, like tipping that off.
uh, I would agree with that, and I think a lot of that is driven by the concern over its current theocratic government, which is Islamic based.
Right, and then their support to Hezbollah and other Iranian militia based supported militias throughout the region, now in Iraq and also in Yemen.
Right. And of course, the Iranian government has been extremely vocal about its distaste for Western governments, specifically the United States, who supports Israel. So, putting all those things together, it's very easy for the United States and Western governments to see Iran radicalizing its nuclear capabilities.
Right. So a little timeline here is that in 2006, the UN imposed economic sanctions, and then 4 years later, they imposed an arm embargo. 5 years after that, the EU and the United States, well, actually, five plus one countries: China, France, Germany, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, entered into an agreement with Iran uh, based on uh, based on to agree to have them not have nuclear proliferation or to enrich uranium, and that was supposed to have monitoring agreements. The inspectors were supposed to go in there and actually verify that they were not enriching uranium past a certain point, which would indicate that they were making weapons grade uranium, which could indicate that they were going to like make a nuclear weapon.
Right. And this was also based on the fact that a lot of the international embargoes, both economic, um, would be would slowly be backed off in succession. It'd be like a progressive reduction in these embargoes.
Right.
So, and at that point, it's important to remember that the the reason Iran's willing to do this or was willing to do this was because their economy was essentially crippled. Once they lost the full support of the Soviet Union, they were essentially at the mercy of all the capitalist economies in the world.
Correct.
So
Yeah. And then
they
there
had no
was
choice.
so there was an agreement. It seemed to be bearing fruit. There was verification that Iran was working within the terms of the agreement. And then in 2018, led by the Trump administration, the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from the agreement. So weirdly, what the U.S. did was, they said we withdrew from it, and then not only that, they threatened sanctions on any other country that decided to abide by the terms of the agreement and not go along with the sanctions.
Correct. And
So what that led to is in 2020, Iran just announced they were going to withdraw from the agreement completely because why bother playing the game with a person or an entity that's not going to abide by any of the rules, so to speak.
well, I think one thing that's worth bringing up, uh, two of the main reasons that the Trump administration stated for the withdrawal. One of them was they were concerned about the sunset clauses as being used as loopholes, and these sunset clauses were essentially over a certain period of time, or once essentially a time limit is reached, Iran can then begin acquiring or producing or stockpiling beyond what the treaty said they could before. So after say 10 years, they could begin enriching uranium at a higher potency than under the agreement. So the Trump
Okay.
administration felt that essentially this was built in loopholes that
Right.
nullified the agreement within a period of 10 years.
Right.
So,
And then
along with their concern about the economic sanctions being removed too quickly. But
right. And then it looks like from a few articles that I've read, it looks like Iran has somewhat changed its economic structure and orientation away from oil revenues, so that there's actually like less reliance on that. So if they are shut out of Western markets and trading, that they can actually uh, still get revenue, and then also look towards China and other, you know, unsavory countries, so to speak.
yeah, essentially well, it could be conjectured that them joining the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action was really sort of a stopgap till they reoriented their economy.
Correct. Yeah, there's that possibility as well. I mean,
because that whole thing took place, both the negotiation and the initial implementation, over a period of 5 to 6 years.
right. So
So
yeah,
that,
they could have given time to like actually made long term plans to
yeah,
get out of it.
and being a centralized economy, they can reorient much quicker than more open capitalist economy. So
True. Now
yeah,
that brings us to the current situation. So there was an interesting series of events. Um, this is more recent, after in this year, 2021. But there was also, if we remember, because so many events have happened over the last year and a half, it's hard to keep track of them all. There was the Israeli murder of their top nuclear scientist, uh, with remote, like a lot
yeah.
of uh, remote machine guns, missiles, like
Mhm.
crazy amount of planning went into that.
It was essentially a drone assassination,
Basically, yeah. Um,
which potentially is what we did. The United States, I apologize, not us, but the United States performed when the assassination of the Iranian general who was involved in what was his specific um, command. It was related to units outside Iran. Is that correct?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah.
So that happened where they assassinated the nuclear scientist. Basically, in response to that, Iran's top political chamber gave approval to a bill forcing the president to end international nuclear inspections unless the U.S. lifted key sanctions by February. This was before. I can't remember. Was this before? This was not. This was after the U.S. election, right?
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and so basically giving the incoming Biden administration just weeks to make a diplomatic breakthrough. Now, obviously, this is now in March, and as far as I'm aware, that has not happened.
So, of course, when Biden was campaigning as for presidency, when he became president elect, he did make it clear that he wanted to go back to the table with Iran. Now, since he's been president, it appears that he's actually following the Trump administration's line as in terms of demanding that Iran come to the table, not the U.S.
Yeah, and then events transpired where, per our slide here, there's a rocket attack that kills some American contractors in
Mm-hmm.
Kurdistan. The U.S. did a retaliatory strike on Iranian-backed militia, which more looked like a border crossing on the Syrian border.
And a truck park.
Right. In addition to that, maybe in retaliation for that, there's not really any way of knowing. There was an explosion on an Israeli cargo ship in the Gulf of Oman, which harkened back to another few attacks on cargo ships a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
As far as we know, Iran has denied any involvement in that. And then, on addition to that, I don't know if this was in response to that or in addition to that, Israel continued airstrikes in Syria against Iranian-backed militias in different sites as well. So it's a kind of a convoluted mess right now.
Yeah, and how much of this would take place irrespective of the issues over the nuclear treaty?
Right.
Because it because Iran already feels that it has the right to be involved in the regional affairs, and of course, Iran and Israel already have made it clear that they are mortal enemies.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's really hard to know. I mean, in all political negotiations, how much is bluster and how much is just bluster to appeal to their like extreme base versus practical considerations on the ground.
yeah, and in terms of what's still taking place in Iraq, and now that the situation in Syria is starting to heat up again, especially with the U.S. going back into Syria
Right.
and just still claiming essentially, sphere of influence with al Bashar. You know, I don't actually see the Iranian nuclear agreement or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action ever having any practicality.
Now that's interesting you say that because apparently there's an article in the Financial Times where a senior Iranian conservative figure and a potential presidential candidate just said that Iran would be ready to resume talks on the nuclear deal with the U.S. and other Western powers if they provide a clear signal that sanctions will be lifted within a year.
Right.
So I think it depends on their leadership whether or not they think it's still in play. But I still think that they would rather have sanctions lifted so that they can actually have some economic success because it's
Hmm.
Iran is actually a very young country population wise.
Hmm.
So if they can't provide that kind of like opportunities and things like that, that could lead to like some serious instability in the future if people don't feel like they
Well,
have a shot at like making a good life for themselves.
and I think you bring up a good point internally. The government still believes it needs to wage a culture war because its young population is far more intellectually and they're far more open than the leadership is, and they have a very restive population.
Right. Yeah, I mean they've
So
had numerous protests over the last 2 to 3 years. Like
yeah,
some pretty.
and they've had protests throughout most of their history. It's just becoming very much more apparent and much more public to the world.
Right.
So yeah,
Exactly. Well,
so they have a lot of things that themselves have to internally deal with. I know
yeah.
we have a slide after this slide, right? Sort of like, um,
Oh
isn't
yeah.
there? Yeah, there it is. Yeah, yeah, the potential roadblocks, which I think we've covered.
Right, right, yeah, except for the Saudi Arabia and the UAE fear of Iran, because yeah, they during the Trump administration, they signed diplomatic agreements with relations with Israel. You also have the Sunni Shiite, the religious aspect of this whole thing,
Hmm.
um, and yeah, if Saudi Arabia and UAE are going to side with Israel, that you're create I don't know, it's almost like a World War I tinderbox, to be honest.
Yeah, they should just bring in the British and redraw the lines.
Again.
Yeah,
Yep.
yeah,
That's what caused half of this stuff to begin with.
that is true. Nobody seemed to worry about ethnic issues. They just simply draw lines on a map.
Right, exactly. Well, we could speculate the rest of this evening, but we're going to call it there. And thanks for joining us on another episode of Geopolitical Geeks and Random Thoughts. If you have any comments to share, go ahead and put them in the on the site. We moderate all comments, but that doesn't mean we're not looking at them. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.